In the scorching heat of July 4th, 1187, at a barren plateau called the Horns of Hattin, the fate of the medieval world hung in the balance. A Kurdish warrior named Salah al-Din stood before the largest crusader army ever assembled in the Holy Land. Within hours, he would shatter Christian dominance in the Levant and establish a dynasty that would reshape the Islamic world for nearly a century. This is the story of the Ayyubid state, a Kurdish dynasty that rose from military service to forge an empire stretching from Egypt to Yemen, from the Nile to the Euphrates. It is the tale of brilliant military strategy, diplomatic cunning, and the complex interplay of faith and politics that defined the medieval Middle East. Over the next 2.5 hours, we will trace the complete arc of Ayyubid power, from the humble beginnings of a Kurdish family in the service of others, through the legendary conquests of Saladin, to the dynasty's eventual fragmentation and fall to their own slave soldiers, the Mamluks. This is not just the story of conquest and defeat, but of how a single family transformed the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the medieval Islamic world. Welcome to Unleash Facts, the place where history secrets, unsolved mysteries, and mind-blowing truths come to light. The year is 1100 CE, and the Islamic world stands fractured and vulnerable. Jerusalem, Islam's third holiest city, has fallen to Crusader knights who slaughtered its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The great Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, once the beacon of Islamic civilization, has been reduced to a mere shadow of its former glory, its power usurped by Turkish warlords and petty dynasties. In this chaotic landscape, three major powers compete for dominance in the Levant and Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate, ruling from Cairo, controls Egypt and claims to be the rightful heirs of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter, Fatima. But their Shiite dynasty is weakening, plagued by succession crises and military defeats. Their grip on power depends increasingly on foreign mercenaries and slave soldiers. To the north, the Zengid dynasty has emerged as the most formidable Muslim force opposing the Crusader states. From their base in Aleppo and Damascus, Imad al-Din Zengi and his son Nur al-Din have begun the systematic reconquest of Crusader territories. Nur al-Din, in particular, presents himself as the champion of Sunni orthodoxy and the holy war against the Christian invaders. The Crusader states themselves: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli form a thin but strategically positioned strip of Christian territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Their survival depends on constant reinforcement from Western Europe and their ability to exploit divisions among their Muslim neighbors. Into this volatile world steps a Kurdish family whose origins lie in the remote mountains of Armenia. The Rawadid Kurds, as they were known, had served various Muslim rulers as professional soldiers. Shadi ibn Marwan, the family patriarch, had distinguished himself in the service of the Abbasid caliphs before moving west to serve the emerging Zengid power. Shadi's sons, Najm al-Din Ayyub and Asad al-Din Shirkuh, would prove to be exceptional military commanders. Najm al-Din Ayyub, whose name would eventually give the dynasty its title, governed the fortress city of Tikrit on behalf of the Zengids. It was here, in this strategic Mesopotamian town, that his son Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born around 1137. The world would later know this child as Saladin. The political fragmentation that characterized the 12th century Islamic world created both opportunity and instability. Local warlords carved out independent territories, paying only nominal allegiance to distant caliphs. Religious divisions between Sunni and Shiite Muslims were exploited by both Christian crusaders and rival Muslim dynasties. Trade routes that had once knitted the Islamic world together were disrupted by constant warfare. Yet this same fragmentation created space for talented military families like the Ayyubids to rise. Professional competence in warfare, rather than noble birth or religious authority, became the primary path to power. The Kurdish origins of the Ayyubids, far from being a disadvantage, actually proved beneficial. They had no tribal loyalties that might conflict with their service to various Muslim rulers. The concept of jihad, or holy war, was experiencing a revival in response to the Crusader conquests. Religious scholars and political leaders increasingly emphasized the religious duty of Muslims to reclaim lost territories. This created a powerful ideological framework that ambitious leaders could exploit to legitimize their political aspirations. The transformation of the Ayyubid family from obscure Kurdish soldiers to power brokers in the Islamic world began with a single moment of political miscalculation. In 1138, Najm al-Din Ayyub, serving as governor of Tikrit for the Zengid dynasty, made the fateful decision to grant refuge to a former Seljuk commander who had fallen from favor. This act of traditional Kurdish hospitality would cost him his position and set in motion the events that would eventually create an empire. Forced to flee Tikrit with his family, including his young son Yusuf, Najm al-Din Ayyub sought sanctuary with Imad al-Din Zengi, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi, recognizing the military talents of the Kurdish family, welcomed them into his service. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential in medieval Islamic history. Imad al-Din Zengi was already emerging as the most effective Muslim opponent of the Crusader states. His capture of Edessa in 1144, the first major Crusader city to fall back into Muslim hands, had electrified the Islamic world and triggered the Second Crusade in response. Zengi understood that effective resistance to the Crusaders required not just military skill, but also the ability to unite the fractured Muslim territories under a single banner. The Kurdish brothers, Najm al-Din Ayyub and Asad al-Din Shirkuh, quickly proved their worth in Zengi's service. Their mountain origins had made them exceptional cavalry commanders, skilled in the type of mobile warfare that was most effective against the heavily armored but less maneuverable Crusader knights. More importantly, their lack of local tribal connections made them reliable agents of Zengi's centralizing ambitions. When Zengi was assassinated by a Frankish slave in 1146, his son Nur al-Din inherited not just his father's territories, but also his Kurdish generals. Nur al-Din proved to be an even more formidable leader than his father, combining military prowess with sophisticated political intelligence and genuine religious conviction. Under his patronage, the Ayyubid brothers would refine the skills that would later enable them to conquer Egypt. Young Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the future Saladin, grew up in this environment of professional military service and Islamic revival. His education encompassed both the martial skills expected of a Kurdish nobleman and the religious learning appropriate to a servant of Nur al-Din's increasingly pious court. Contemporary sources describe him as an intelligent but unremarkable young man, more interested in religious studies than military glory. The political situation in Egypt during the 1150s and 1160s provided the opportunity that would transform the Ayyubids from competent soldiers into rulers. The Fatimid Caliphate was in terminal decline, weakened by succession disputes, economic crisis, and military defeats. The Caliph had become a figurehead, with real power held by a series of competing viziers who struggled to maintain control over an increasingly rebellious army and populace. Both the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem and Nur al-Din's Syrian territories recognized that control of Egypt's wealth would be decisive in the broader struggle for the Levant. Egypt's agricultural riches, generated by the annual flooding of the Nile, could fund massive military campaigns. The country's position at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean made it a crucial strategic prize. The first major Egyptian expedition came in 1163, when the Crusader king Amalric I launched an invasion aimed at placing a compliant vizier in power in Cairo. Nur al-Din responded by dispatching his own military intervention, led by Asad al-Din Shirkuh and the young Saladin. This would be the first of three major campaigns that would ultimately determine the fate of Egypt and, by extension, the entire region. The complexity of Egyptian politics in this period cannot be overstated. Multiple factions within the Fatimid court competed for influence, while the civilian population chafed under heavy taxation and foreign military occupation. Religious divisions between the Shiite ruling elite and the predominantly Sunni population created additional instability. Into this chaos stepped the Kurdish generals, who would prove more adept at navigating Egyptian complexities than either their Crusader rivals or their Zengid masters. The struggle for Egypt between 1163 and 1169 would be decided not by grand battles, but by political cunning, strategic patience, and the ability to survive in one of the most treacherous political environments in the medieval world. The stakes could not have been higher. Control of Egypt would shift the balance of power throughout the Levant and determine whether the Islamic world could effectively challenge Crusader dominance. The first Syrian intervention in Egypt came in response to a desperate plea from the Fatimid vizier Shawar, who had been overthrown by his rival Durgam. In 1163, Shawar approached Nur al-Din, offering tribute and alliance in exchange for military assistance to regain his position. Nur al-Din, recognizing the strategic opportunity, dispatched an army under the command of Asad al-Din Shirkuh, accompanied by his nephew Saladin. Shirkuh's expedition succeeded brilliantly. Durgam was defeated and killed, and Shawar was restored as vizier. However, Shawar immediately proved treacherous, reneging on his promises and demanding that the Syrian forces withdraw from Egypt. When Shirkuh refused, Shawar made the fateful decision to ally with the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem against his former allies. This betrayal created the bizarre spectacle of a Shiite Muslim vizier allying with Christian crusaders against Sunni Muslim forces sent to help him. The complexity of these relationships illustrates the degree to which pragmatic political considerations often trumped religious loyalties in the medieval Middle East. For the Ayyubids, it provided crucial lessons in the fluid nature of political allegiance. King Amalric III of Jerusalem responded eagerly to Shawar's overture. An alliance with Egypt would not only provide access to the country's wealth, but also prevent Nur al-Din from establishing a strategic presence south of the Crusader states. In 1164, a combined Fatimid Crusader army besieged the Syrian forces at Bilbais, forcing Shirkuh and Saladin to withdraw temporarily to Syria. However, Nur al-Din was not prepared to abandon his Egyptian ambitions. In 1167, he launched a second expedition under Shirkuh's command. This time, the Kurdish general adopted a different strategy, avoiding direct confrontation with the combined Fatimid Crusader forces and instead launching a rapid march toward Upper Egypt. This move threatened to cut off Cairo from its southern territories and forced his opponents to pursue him. The campaign that followed demonstrated Shirkuh's exceptional strategic vision. By keeping his forces mobile and avoiding pitched battles, he forced the heavier Crusader Egyptian army to exhaust itself in pursuit. The climactic engagement came at Al-Babain in Upper Egypt, where Shirkuh achieved a decisive victory that eliminated the immediate military threat to his expedition. More importantly, Shirkuh's presence in Upper Egypt triggered a popular uprising against the Fatimid government. The predominantly Sunni population, long oppressed by their Shiite rulers, saw the Syrian forces as liberators rather than invaders. This popular support provided Shirkuh with local allies and intelligence networks that proved crucial to his eventual success. The political situation became even more complex when Shawar, recognizing the growing weakness of his position, began secret negotiations with Shirkuh while maintaining his public alliance with the Crusaders. These double dealings reflected the desperate circumstances of the Fatimid regime, but they also demonstrated the opportunities available to skilled political operators like the Ayyubids. Saladin's role in these campaigns was gradually expanding. Initially serving as a subordinate commander under his uncle, he began to demonstrate the combination of military skill and political acumen that would later make him famous. Contemporary sources suggest that he was particularly effective in the diplomatic aspects of the campaigns, building relationships with local Egyptian leaders that would prove valuable in the future. The third and final Syrian expedition to Egypt came in 1168. Triggered by King Amalric's decision to launch a direct invasion of Egypt without consulting his Fatimid allies. This betrayal finally convinced Shawar that his alliance with the Crusaders was untenable, and he once again appealed to Nur al-Din for assistance. The aging Asad al-Din Shirkuh, now recognized as the most effective general in Nur al-Din's service, was given command of the expedition that would determine Egypt's fate. The 1169 campaign differed markedly from its predecessors. Rather than facing a united Fatimid Crusader alliance, Shirkuh found himself welcomed by Shawar as an ally against the Crusader invaders. The Syrian forces were able to enter Egypt without opposition and immediately began coordinating with Fatimid forces against the common enemy. King Amalric, recognizing that his position had become untenable, withdrew his forces from Egypt in exchange for a substantial tribute payment. This retreat marked the end of serious Crusader attempts to conquer Egypt and left the field clear for the final resolution of the Syrian-Egyptian relationship. The death of Asad al-Din Shirkuh on March 23, 1169, just 2 months after his triumphant entry into Cairo, created a power vacuum that would transform not just Egypt, but the entire medieval Islamic world. When Shirkuh died, Saladin quickly consolidated power, demonstrating a political sophistication that surprised both his allies and enemies. At the time of his uncle's death, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, was barely 32 years old and had never held independent command. The Syrian army in Egypt consisted of hardened veterans who had served under Shirkuh for years, many of whom had little reason to accept the authority of this relatively inexperienced young man. Moreover, the Fatimid vizier Shawar viewed Shirkuh's death as an opportunity to regain his independence and rid Egypt of Syrian military occupation. Saladin's first challenge came from within his own ranks. Several senior Syrian commanders believed they had superior claims to leadership based on their military experience and closer relationships with Nur al-Din. The most prominent of these was Karakush al-Asadi, a veteran Turkish general who commanded significant loyalty among the troops. However, Saladin possessed advantages that his rivals lacked. His family connections were crucial. Not only was he Shirkuh's nephew, but his father Najm al-Din Ayyub remained an influential figure in Nur al-Din's court in Damascus. More importantly, Saladin had spent the Egyptian campaigns building relationships with local leaders and religious scholars, creating a network of support that extended beyond the Syrian military. The decisive moment came when the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid, manipulated by his vizier Shawar, attempted to play the Syrian commanders against each other. Shawar secretly contacted several of Saladin's rivals, promising them positions and rewards if they would help eliminate the young Kurdish leader. This conspiracy backfired spectacularly when Saladin learned of it through his intelligence network. On April 20th, 1169, Saladin struck with decisive efficiency. Shawar was arrested while visiting the Syrian camp, supposedly for routine military consultations. Within hours, he had been executed and Saladin had been appointed as the new vizier of Egypt by the puppet Caliph Al-Adid. The speed and audacity of this coup impressed both the Syrian commanders and the Egyptian political elite. But Saladin's position remained precarious. As vizier, he was theoretically the servant of the Fatimid Caliph, who remained the nominal ruler of Egypt. Simultaneously, he owed allegiance to Nur al-Din in Damascus, who had sent him to Egypt and expected regular tribute from the country's wealth. This dual loyalty created inherent tensions that would eventually lead to open conflict. The young vizier's first priority was consolidating control over the Egyptian military apparatus. The Fatimid army consisted of a bewildering array of different units: Armenian infantry, Sudanese cavalry, Turkish Mamluks, Berber tribesmen, and various mercenary contingents. Many of these units had conflicting loyalties and ethnic rivalries that made unified command extremely difficult. Saladin's solution was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than attempting to eliminate existing military units, he gradually placed his own trusted commanders in key positions while maintaining the appearance of continuity. Syrian officers were appointed to senior posts, but they were instructed to work with, rather than against, existing Egyptian commanders who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime. The economic dimension of Saladin's consolidation was equally important. Egypt's wealth derived primarily from agriculture along the Nile, but also from trade taxes collected in Alexandria and other Mediterranean ports. The vizier needed to maintain sufficient revenue to fund his military forces, while also sending tribute to Nur al-Din and supporting the Fatimid court's ceremonial expenses. Contemporary financial records, preserved in the Cairo Geniza documents, provide remarkable insight into Saladin's administrative efficiency. Within months of taking power, he had reformed the tax collection system, eliminated many corrupt practices that had enriched previous viziers, and established more equitable policies that reduced popular resentment while actually increasing government revenues. The religious dimension of Saladin's position was perhaps the most delicate. As a Sunni Muslim serving as vizier to a Shiite caliph, he occupied an inherently contradictory position. The Fatimid caliphs claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and his cousin Ali, and they viewed themselves as the rightful leaders of the entire Islamic world. Their Shiite interpretation of Islam differed significantly from the Sunni orthodoxy championed by Nur al-Din. Saladin navigated this religious minefield with remarkable skill. He maintained the forms of respect toward the Fatimid Caliph while gradually introducing Sunni practices and scholars into positions of influence. This process was facilitated by the fact that most Egyptians were Sunni Muslims who had never fully accepted Shiite rule. Popular support for a return to Sunni orthodoxy provided Saladin with a crucial source of legitimacy. The international situation also favored Saladin's consolidation. The Crusader states, having been expelled from Egypt, were preoccupied with internal succession disputes and conflicts with each other. The Byzantine Empire, traditional rivals of both the Crusaders and the Muslims, were engaged in their own territorial disputes in Anatolia. This relative calm on Egypt's frontiers gave Saladin the breathing space he needed to establish his authority. However, the most significant challenge to Saladin's position came not from external enemies, but from his own nominal superior, Nur al-Din. The Syrian ruler had initially been pleased with his protégé's success, but he gradually became concerned about Saladin's growing independence and the irregular nature of tribute payments from Egypt. By 1171, the relationship between Saladin and his nominal superior Nur al-Din had evolved into a complex dance of mutual dependence and growing suspicion. What had begun as a straightforward master-servant relationship was transforming into something far more dangerous. A contest between two ambitious rulers who increasingly saw each other as rivals rather than allies. The catalyst for this transformation was Saladin's abolition of the Fatimid Caliphate on September 10, 1171. This momentous decision, taken without explicit authorization from Damascus, marked the end of nearly 3 centuries of Shiite rule in Egypt and formally integrated the country into the Sunni world, dominated by the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The circumstances surrounding the end of the Fatimid Caliphate reveal much about Saladin's political sophistication. The last Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, was gravely ill and showed no signs of recovery. Rather than waiting for his natural death, which might have triggered succession disputes or allowed rival claimants to emerge, Saladin orchestrated a carefully managed transition. On that Friday in September, the khutbah, the weekly Friday prayer sermon, was delivered in Cairo's mosques in the name of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustadi in Baghdad, rather than the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid. This seemingly simple change in religious protocol had profound political implications. By acknowledging Abbasid rather than Fatimid authority, Saladin was declaring Egypt's integration into the broader Sunni Islamic world. The reaction was surprisingly muted. The Fatimid dynasty had become so weakened and unpopular that their abolition provoked little resistance. Al-Adid himself died just 2 days later, possibly from natural causes, though some sources suggest he may have been poisoned. The Fatimid court, deprived of its central figure, simply dissolved without organized opposition. More significantly, the abolition of the Fatimid Caliphate freed Saladin from one layer of his complex loyalties. No longer serving as vizier to a rival caliph, he could present himself as the direct representative of Sunni orthodoxy in Egypt. This enhanced his religious legitimacy and simplified his relationship with religious scholars and the general population. However, it also intensified his conflict with Nur al-Din. The Syrian ruler had expected to be consulted about such a momentous decision, and Saladin's unilateral action suggested a level of independence that threatened Nur al-Din's authority. The tribute payments from Egypt, already irregular, became even more sporadic as Saladin increasingly treated Egypt's resources as his own, rather than as assets belonging to his Damascus-based superior. The growing tension between the two leaders was exacerbated by their different approaches to the Crusader threat. Nur al-Din favored a coordinated strategy that would unite Muslim forces throughout the Levant under his supreme command. Saladin, while publicly supporting this goal, was increasingly reluctant to subordinate Egyptian resources to Syrian strategic priorities. This divergence became apparent during the various military campaigns of the early 1170s. When Nur al-Din requested Egyptian assistance for operations against the Crusader fortresses of Kerak and Montreal, Saladin's responses were characterized by delays, excuses, and minimal commitments of forces. These actions were justified by the need to consolidate control in Egypt, but they clearly indicated Saladin's reluctance to facilitate Nur al-Din's strategic objectives. The personal relationship between the two men was further complicated by reports of Saladin's growing wealth and ceremonial pretensions. Egyptian revenues were being used to fund a lavish court in Cairo, complete with the ceremonial traditions previously associated with the Fatimid caliphs. Nur al-Din, who maintained a relatively austere lifestyle in Damascus, viewed these developments as evidence of his subordinates' disloyalty and ingratitude. Intelligence networks operating between Damascus and Cairo carried increasingly alarming reports in both directions. Nur al-Din learned of Saladin's independent diplomatic contacts with various regional powers, including the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and even some Crusader leaders. Saladin, meanwhile, received reports of Nur al-Din's growing displeasure and possible plans for military intervention to restore proper subordination. The crisis reached its climax in 1173, when Nur al-Din began assembling a large army in Damascus, ostensibly for operations against the Crusader states, but widely understood to be intended for an invasion of Egypt. Contemporary sources describe frantic diplomatic activity as both rulers attempted to secure allies and justify their positions to the broader Islamic world. Saladin's response to this threat revealed the full extent of his political transformation. Rather than submitting to his nominal superior, he began preparing Egypt's defenses for what appeared to be an inevitable conflict. Egyptian fortifications were strengthened, the army was expanded with new recruits and mercenaries, and diplomatic overtures were made to potential allies who might support Egyptian independence. The confrontation that could have torn the Islamic world apart was prevented only by Nur al-Din's sudden death on May 15, 1174. The Syrian ruler, only 57 years old and apparently in good health, died unexpectedly in Damascus, possibly from complications of a routine illness. His death removed the primary obstacle to Saladin's independence and created new opportunities for expansion that would transform the political landscape of the medieval Middle East. Nur al-Din's heir was his 11-year-old son Al-Salih Ismail, whose minority created a power vacuum in Damascus that various Syrian commanders and administrators rushed to fill. The regency that emerged was weak and divided, unable to provide the strong central authority that had characterized Nur al-Din's rule. This instability gave Saladin the opportunity he needed to expand beyond Egypt's borders. The young Ayyubid ruler's first target was Damascus itself. By claiming to act as the protector of Al-Salih Ismail against ambitious regents, Saladin could present his intervention as legitimate support for Nur al-Din's heir, rather than naked aggression. This political sophistication would characterize all of Saladin's subsequent expansion. The death of Nur al-Din in May 1174 transformed Saladin from a rebellious subordinate into the most powerful independent ruler in the Islamic Middle East. But with this opportunity came enormous challenges. To survive and prosper, he would need to quickly establish control over Syria, while simultaneously defending Egypt against Crusader attacks and managing the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized medieval Muslim politics. Saladin's initial move was characteristically audacious. Rather than waiting for formal recognition or invitation, he marched out of Egypt in October 1174 with a substantial army, ostensibly to protect the young Al-Salih Ismail from the predatory ambitions of his regents. This intervention was carefully calculated to appear legitimate while serving Saladin's strategic objectives. The Regency Council in Damascus faced an impossible choice. They lacked the military strength to resist Saladin's army, but accepting his protection would effectively end their independence. Some members favored immediate submission, while others advocated resistance with assistance from the Crusader states or other Muslim rivals of Saladin. The decisive factor was popular opinion in Damascus. Saladin had cultivated a reputation as the defender of Sunni orthodoxy and the champion of jihad against the Crusaders. His abolition of the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate had enhanced his religious credentials, while his efficient administration of Egypt suggested he could provide the strong government that Syria desperately needed. When Saladin's army approached Damascus in November 1174, the city's gates opened without resistance. The young Al-Salih Ismail was ceremonially maintained as ruler, but real power passed immediately to Saladin, who established himself in the citadel as the boy's protector and effective regent. However, controlling Damascus did not mean controlling Syria. The Zengid territories had been divided among various family members and commanders, each of whom ruled their portion with considerable autonomy. Aleppo, the most important Syrian city after Damascus, remained under the control of Saif al-Din Ghazi, Nur al-Din's brother, who had no intention of submitting to Saladin's authority. The consolidation of Syria would require a series of military campaigns that would test all of Saladin's strategic skills. Each city and fortress had its own political dynamics, its own local alliances, and its own reasons for resisting or supporting Ayyubid expansion. Some welcomed Saladin as a liberator from weak or oppressive local rulers, while others viewed him as a foreign usurper threatening their traditional autonomy. The siege of Aleppo, which began in December 1174, illustrated the complexity of Saladin's position. Militarily, the city was strongly fortified and well defended by troops loyal to Saif al-Din Ghazi. Politically, an attack on Aleppo could be portrayed as aggression against the legitimate Zengid heir, potentially alienating other Muslim rulers who might otherwise support Saladin. More problematically, the siege of Aleppo provided an opportunity for Saladin's enemies to form a coalition against him. The Crusader states, recognizing that a united Muslim Syria would pose a much greater threat than the current fragmented situation, began providing assistance to Aleppo's defenders. Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch were particularly active in supporting the anti-Saladin coalition. The involvement of Crusader forces in defending a Muslim city against another Muslim ruler illustrates the complex nature of medieval Middle Eastern politics. Religious identity, while important, was often subordinated to immediate political and strategic considerations. Christian and Muslim rulers regularly allied with each other when their interests coincided, regardless of broader religious conflicts. Saladin's response to this challenge demonstrated his growing political sophistication. Rather than persisting with a potentially costly siege, he negotiated a face-saving compromise that allowed him to withdraw while maintaining his dignity and strategic position. Saif al-Din Ghazi would remain in control of Aleppo, but he would acknowledge Saladin's broader authority and coordinate military policy with Damascus and Cairo. This pragmatic approach characterized Saladin's entire Syrian campaign. Where possible, he preferred negotiation and accommodation to prolonged siege warfare. Local rulers who submitted to his authority were often confirmed in their positions, provided they demonstrated loyalty and contributed to his military campaigns. This policy created incentives for voluntary submission while reducing the costs of conquest. The consolidation of central Syria proceeded more smoothly. Cities like Homs, Hama, and Baalbek recognized that resistance was futile given Saladin's overwhelming military superiority and the weak support available from other Zengid territories. By the summer of 1175, Saladin controlled most of Syria south of Aleppo, creating a unified political entity that had not existed since the early Zengid period. However, unification brought new responsibilities and challenges. The various Syrian territories had different administrative systems, legal traditions, and military structures that needed to be integrated without destroying local loyalties. Saladin's solution was to maintain existing institutions while gradually placing his own trusted administrators and commanders in key positions. The economic integration of Syria and Egypt proved particularly beneficial. Syrian agricultural products and manufactured goods found ready markets in Egypt, while Egyptian wealth funded the development of Syrian infrastructure and military capabilities. Trade routes that had been disrupted by political fragmentation were restored and protected, generating revenue that strengthened both territories. Religious integration was equally important. Saladin's reputation as the defender of Sunni orthodoxy helped legitimize his rule throughout Syria, where the population had welcomed Nur al-Din's emphasis on Islamic revival and jihad against the Crusaders. The appointment of respected religious scholars to judicial and educational positions in major Syrian cities reinforced this legitimacy. The establishment of the Ayyubid dynasty's administrative structure during this period would prove crucial to its long-term success. Rather than ruling personally from a single capital, Saladin developed a system of family-based governance that distributed power among his brothers, sons, and trusted Kurdish commanders. This approach provided flexibility and local knowledge while maintaining central coordination. Al-Adil, Saladin's younger brother, emerged as his most important lieutenant during the Syrian campaigns. His combination of military skill and administrative competence made him invaluable for governing conquered territories, while Saladin continued his expansion. The relationship between the two brothers would prove to be one of the most successful partnerships in medieval Islamic history. By 1176, Saladin had achieved what many considered impossible: the unification of Egypt and Syria under a single ruler. This accomplishment provided him with the resources and strategic position necessary to challenge Crusader dominance in the Levant. The stage was now set for the great confrontation that would define his historical legacy. The decade between 1177 and 1187 would witness the gradual escalation of tensions between Saladin's unified Muslim territories and the Crusader states, culminating in the most decisive battle of the medieval Middle East. This period reveals not just military preparation, but the complex interplay of diplomacy, espionage, and psychological warfare that preceded the famous confrontation at the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's initial attempts to leverage his unified territories against the Crusader states met with mixed success. His first major offensive, launched in November 1177, ended in unexpected disaster at the Battle of Montgizard, where the 16-year-old leper king Baldwin IV of Jerusalem achieved a stunning victory that nearly destroyed Saladin's army and reputation. The defeat at Montgizard was a sobering reminder that military unification alone was insufficient to guarantee victory. Baldwin IV, despite his debilitating illness, had demonstrated exceptional tactical brilliance by coordinating a surprise attack that caught Saladin's forces scattered and unprepared. The young Ayyubid ruler barely escaped with his life, and his army suffered catastrophic losses that would take years to replace. More damaging than the military defeat was the psychological impact. Saladin's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated during his rise to power, was shattered. Muslim chroniclers struggled to explain how the champion of jihad had been so decisively defeated by a teenage Christian king. Some questioned whether God truly favored Saladin's cause, while others suggested that his rapid rise had made him overconfident and careless. The immediate aftermath of Montgizard revealed the fragility of Saladin's political position. Several Syrian lords who had submitted to his authority began questioning their allegiance. The Zengid rulers of Aleppo and Mosul, still resentful of Saladin's expansion, saw an opportunity to reclaim lost territories. Most dangerously, a coalition began forming among various Muslim rulers who viewed Saladin's weakness as an opportunity to challenge his dominance. Saladin's response to this crisis demonstrated the political maturity that would ultimately make him successful. Rather than immediately seeking revenge against the Crusaders, he focused on consolidating his internal position and rebuilding his military capabilities. This strategic patience, though criticized by some contemporary observers as cowardice, proved to be exactly the right approach. The rebuilding process took nearly 3 years and involved fundamental reforms to Saladin's military and administrative systems. The army was reorganized with better coordination between different units and improved intelligence gathering. Administrative reforms increased revenue collection efficiency, providing more resources for military preparation. Most importantly, Saladin invested heavily in developing a network of spies and informants throughout the Crusader territories. The diplomatic dimension of Saladin's recovery was equally important. He negotiated a series of truces with various Crusader leaders, using the breathing space to strengthen his position while simultaneously gathering intelligence about his enemies' capabilities and intentions. These truces were frequently violated by both sides, but they served Saladin's strategic purposes by preventing the Crusaders from exploiting his temporary weakness. The arrival of new crusading expeditions from Western Europe during this period complicated the regional balance of power. The presence of fresh troops and experienced commanders from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire temporarily strengthened the Crusader state's military capabilities. However, it also created tensions between the established Crusader nobility and the newcomers, divisions that Saladin would eventually exploit. Religious revival played a crucial role in Saladin's recovery. He intensified his patronage of religious scholars and institutions, positioning himself as the authentic champion of Islamic orthodoxy against Christian aggression. This campaign was remarkably successful, generating popular support throughout the Muslim world and providing moral legitimacy for his political ambitions. The construction of madrasas, Islamic schools, and the appointment of respected scholars to judicial positions helped integrate Saladin's territories culturally as well as politically. These institutions promoted a unified interpretation of Islamic law and theology that transcended the tribal and regional divisions that had previously fragmented Muslim resistance to the Crusaders. By 1182, Saladin felt sufficiently confident to resume offensive operations against the Crusader states. His targets were carefully chosen to maximize strategic advantage while minimizing risk. Rather than attempting another direct assault on Jerusalem, he focused on isolating and capturing the fortified positions that controlled key trade routes and communication lines. The siege of Kerak in 1183 marked the beginning of Saladin's systematic campaign to strangle the Crusader states economically. Kerak controlled the vital trade route between Damascus and Mecca, and its Crusader garrison regularly attacked Muslim pilgrims and merchants. By capturing this fortress, Saladin could simultaneously improve his strategic position and demonstrate his commitment to protecting Islamic pilgrimage. The siege also revealed the growing effectiveness of Saladin's reformed military. His engineers had developed improved siege techniques, while his cavalry demonstrated better coordination and discipline than in previous campaigns. More importantly, the army's morale was high, restored by 3 years of careful preparation and religious indoctrination. However, the siege of Kerak was lifted when a relief army arrived under the command of Guy de Lusignan, who had recently married Sibylla of Jerusalem and claimed the regency during Baldwin IV's illness. This encounter provided Saladin with valuable intelligence about the new Crusader leadership and their military capabilities. The political situation within the Crusader states was increasingly unstable. Baldwin IV's leprosy was advancing, and disputes over the succession were dividing the nobility. Raymond III of Tripoli, the most experienced Crusader commander, was frequently at odds with Guy de Lusignan and other court factions. These divisions provided opportunities that Saladin would eventually exploit decisively. The year 1185 marked a crucial turning point with the death of Baldwin IV and the succession crisis that followed. The 8-year-old Baldwin V became nominal king, but real power was contested between various noble factions. When Baldwin V died in 1186, the succession dispute exploded into open conflict, ultimately placing Guy de Lusignan on the throne despite significant opposition from Raymond III and other experienced leaders. Saladin recognized that this internal division provided the opportunity he had been waiting for. Guy de Lusignan was inexperienced in Middle Eastern warfare and lacked the political skills necessary to unite the fractious Crusader nobility. More importantly, the succession crisis had weakened the Crusader state's military capabilities at exactly the moment when Saladin's strength was reaching its peak. The final provocation came from Reynald de Chatillon, the Lord of Kerak, whose attack on a Muslim caravan in early 1187 violated the existing truce agreements. This incident provided Saladin with the legal and moral justification he needed to launch the comprehensive campaign that would culminate at Hattin. The stage was set for the confrontation that would determine the fate of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. July 4th, 1187, the Horns of Hattin. In the scorching heat of a Galilean summer, two armies faced each other in what would become the most consequential battle of the crusading era. The largest Crusader army ever assembled in the Holy Land, nearly 20,000 men, including 200 heavy cavalry, confronted Saladin's unified Muslim forces in a contest that would reshape the medieval world. The campaign leading to Hattin had been a masterpiece of strategic deception. Saladin's siege of Tiberias in late June was a carefully calculated move designed to force the Crusader army into exactly the position he desired. By attacking the city, he threatened the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli, creating a situation that honor demanded the Crusaders' relieve, regardless of strategic considerations. The Crusader War Council at Syria revealed the fatal divisions within their leadership. Raymond III, the most experienced commander, argued strenuously against marching to relieve Tiberias. He understood that Saladin was attempting to draw them away from water sources and into terrain of his choosing. Guy de Lusignan initially accepted this advice, but was then persuaded by Reynald de Chatillon and Gérard de Riedfort to reverse his decision overnight. This reversal would prove catastrophic. The decision to march from Syria to Tiberias meant crossing 15 miles of waterless terrain in the height of summer, while under constant harassment from Saladin's mobile cavalry. Worse, it meant abandoning a strong defensive position for the uncertainties of a relief operation that played directly into enemy hands. The march itself was a nightmare of military incompetence. The Crusader army, weighed down by heavy armor and supplies, moved slowly across the arid landscape, while Saladin's archers maintained constant pressure. Muslim engineers had blocked wells along the route, and the July heat became almost unbearable for men encased in metal armor. By the evening of July 3rd, the Crusader army had covered only half the distance to Tiberias and was desperately short of water. Guy de Lusignan made the final fatal decision to camp overnight near the village of Hattin, despite being within sight of the Sea of Galilee and its life-saving water. This decision sealed the army's fate. Saladin's tactical dispositions revealed his evolution from the inexperienced commander defeated at Montgisard to a master strategist. He positioned his forces to block all routes to water while maintaining the mobility to strike at vulnerable points in the Crusader formation. Most importantly, he had achieved the psychological advantage. His troops were confident and well supplied, while their enemies were demoralized and desperately thirsty. The battle began at dawn on July 4th, with Saladin's archers setting fire to the dry grass around the Crusader camp. The smoke and flames added to the already unbearable heat, while the constant arrow fire prevented any organized movement. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of incredible suffering as heavily armored knights and infantry struggled to maintain formation while being slowly destroyed by heat, thirst, and continuous harassment. The Crusader infantry, predominantly foot soldiers who lacked the mobility of the heavy cavalry, were the first to break. Maddened by thirst and seeing no hope of relief, they attempted to fight their way to the waters of the Sea of Galilee, visible but tantalizingly out of reach. This mass desertion left the cavalry isolated and vulnerable to Saladin's concentrated attacks. Raymond III of Tripoli, recognizing that the battle was lost, led his contingent in a desperate charge that briefly broke through Saladin's lines. Whether this was a genuine attempt to rally the army or an act of self-preservation remains debated by historians, but it had the effect of removing one of the few competent Crusader commanders from the field. The final phase of the battle saw the systematic destruction of the Crusader heavy cavalry, the military elite of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Without infantry support and weakened by heat and thirst, even these formidable warriors could not withstand the coordinated attacks of Saladin's fresh troops. King Guy himself was captured, along with most of his leading nobles. The aftermath of Hattin was almost as significant as the battle itself. Saladin's treatment of his prisoners revealed both his political sophistication and his religious convictions. While most captured knights were ransomed according to medieval custom, he personally executed Reynald de Chatillon, whose attacks on Muslim pilgrims had violated sacred truces. This act sent a clear message about the consequences of transgressing Islamic law. More strategically important was Saladin's immediate exploitation of his victory. Rather than pausing to consolidate, he launched rapid campaigns to capture the now defenseless Crusader cities. Acre fell within a week, followed by Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, and dozens of smaller fortresses. The speed of these conquests demonstrated the totality of the Crusader military collapse. The capture of Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, marked the culmination of Saladin's triumph. The Holy City had been the primary objective of the crusading movement for nearly a century, and its fall sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe. However, Saladin's conduct during the siege and occupation revealed his commitment to the principles of Islamic warfare. Unlike the Crusader capture of Jerusalem in 1099, which had resulted in massive slaughter of Muslim and Jewish civilians, Saladin's conquest was marked by restraint and mercy. Christian inhabitants were allowed to ransom themselves or leave safely, while churches were protected from desecration. This magnanimous treatment enhanced Saladin's reputation throughout both the Islamic and Christian worlds. The diplomatic consequences of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem were immediately apparent. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the news, while his successor Gregory VIII proclaimed the Third Crusade to reclaim the Holy City. The most powerful rulers of Western Europe, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I of Germany, took the cross and began preparing massive expeditions to restore Christian control of Jerusalem. Within the Islamic world, Saladin's victories established him as the undisputed leader of the Muslim resistance to the Crusaders. Rulers who had previously challenged his authority now sought alliance with the victor of Hattin. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad granted him the title King of Kings, while popular celebration throughout the Islamic world confirmed his status as a hero of the faith. However, Saladin understood that his conquests would inevitably provoke a massive Christian response. European resources far exceeded those available to any Muslim ruler, and the loss of Jerusalem would motivate unprecedented crusading efforts. The period of triumph after Hattin was also a time of urgent preparation for the greater challenges ahead. The redistribution of conquered territories among Saladin's family members and lieutenants established the administrative structure that would govern the expanded Ayyubid state. His brother Al-Adil received significant territories in Palestine, while various sons and nephews were appointed to govern captured cities. This system ensured loyalty while providing experienced administration for newly conquered regions. The years 1187 to 1189 represented the peak of Saladin's power and the high watermark of medieval Islamic expansion. From his capital in Damascus, he controlled territories stretching from Egypt to northern Syria, from the Mediterranean coast to the Arabian desert. No Muslim ruler since the early Abbasid caliphs had wielded comparable power, and none would do so again until the rise of the Ottoman Empire centuries later. The arrival of the Third Crusade in 1190 confronted Saladin with the greatest challenge of his career. The combined might of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, led by three of medieval Europe's most formidable rulers, represented a threat that dwarfed anything the Islamic world had previously faced. Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa commanded resources and military expertise that could potentially reverse all of Saladin's conquests. The Third Crusade differed fundamentally from its predecessors in scale, organization, and leadership quality. Previous crusading expeditions had been largely composed of lesser nobles and volunteer forces with limited logistical support. The Third Crusade brought professional armies led by experienced commanders, supported by the full resources of major European kingdoms, and motivated by the unprecedented catastrophe of Jerusalem's loss. Saladin's intelligence network provided detailed reports of the crusading preparations, and the scope of the threat was immediately apparent. Frederick Barbarossa's German army alone numbered over 100,000 men, while the combined English and French forces added another 100,000. Even accounting for medieval chroniclers' tendency toward exaggeration, these expeditions represented military forces larger than any single Muslim ruler could match. The strategic challenge facing Saladin was how to defend his vast but thinly held territories against multiple simultaneous attacks. The Ayyubid state, despite its impressive geographical extent, had significant vulnerabilities. Many recently conquered cities had been garrisoned with small forces, while the loyalty of some local populations remained questionable. Most critically, Saladin's army, though victorious, had been fighting continuously for years and was showing signs of fatigue. The first phase of the Third Crusade began tragically for the Christians, with Frederick Barbarossa's death by drowning in June 1190. This unexpected loss deprived the crusade of its most experienced military commander and led to the disintegration of the German expedition. While some German forces continued to the Holy Land under Frederick's son, the cohesion and overwhelming strength of the original army was lost. However, the English and French expeditions remained formidable threats. Richard I, known as the Lionheart, had established a fearsome reputation during his campaigns in France and possessed both exceptional military skills and the resources of the wealthy English kingdom. Philip II, though less charismatic than Richard, was an astute strategist who had significantly expanded French royal power during his reign. The Siege of Acre, which began in August 1189, became the focal point of the Third Crusade and the greatest test of Saladin's strategic abilities. The port city was crucial to Crusader logistics, as it provided the only suitable harbor for European supply ships. More importantly, the siege became a symbolic contest between Christian determination and Muslim resistance that captured the attention of both civilizations. Saladin's response to the siege revealed both his strengths and limitations as a military commander. His army successfully surrounded the Crusader besiegers, creating the unusual situation of a double siege, with Acre's Muslim garrison trapped between Christian attackers and Saladin's relieving forces. However, he proved unable to break the siege decisively, despite launching numerous attacks over nearly 2 years. The prolonged nature of the siege imposed severe strains on both sides. The Crusader army suffered from disease, supply shortages, and constant harassment by Saladin's forces. Contemporary accounts describe horrific conditions within the Christian camp, with thousands dying from illness and malnutrition. However, the continuous arrival of reinforcements from Europe maintained the siege's viability. Saladin's forces faced their own challenges during the siege. The need to maintain a large army in the field for an extended period strained the resources of the Ayyubid state, while the constant warfare prevented normal economic activities. More problematically, some of Saladin's supporters began questioning the wisdom of prolonged defensive warfare rather than seeking decisive battle. The arrival of Richard I and Philip II at Acre in 1191 transformed the strategic situation. Both kings brought fresh troops, advanced siege equipment, and substantial financial resources that reinvigorated the Crusader effort. More importantly, their presence restored Christian morale and provided the kind of inspirational leadership that had been lacking during the early phases of the siege. Richard's military innovations proved particularly troublesome for Saladin's defensive strategy. The English king's systematic approach to siege warfare, combined with his use of crossbowmen and advanced artillery, gradually wore down Acre's defenses. His coordination of naval and land operations prevented Saladin from resupplying the besieged garrison effectively. The fall of Acre on July 12, 1191, after a siege lasting nearly 2 years, marked a significant strategic defeat for Saladin. The loss of this crucial port city provided the Crusaders with a secure base for further operations, while the capture of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners gave them valuable bargaining chips for future negotiations. More damaging was the psychological impact of the defeat. Saladin's aura of invincibility, restored after Hattin, was again called into question. Some of his allies began reconsidering their support, while the Christian victory encouraged additional crusading expeditions from Europe. The momentum that had characterized Saladin's conquests was clearly shifting toward his enemies. Richard's controversial execution of the Acre prisoners, carried out when negotiations for their ransom collapsed, demonstrated the ruthless determination of the new Crusader leadership. This act, while condemned by many contemporary observers, sent a clear message that the Third Crusade would be prosecuted with unprecedented vigor and that traditional conventions of medieval warfare might not apply. The period following Acre's fall saw a series of engagements that showcased both Richard's tactical brilliance and Saladin's adaptive capabilities. The Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191, became a classic encounter between Western heavy cavalry and Eastern mobile tactics. Disciplined advance and controlled cavalry charge defeated Saladin's army, but the Muslim forces retreated in good order, preserving their strength for future encounters. Saladin's strategy during this phase reveals his evolution as a commander. Rather than seeking decisive battles that might result in catastrophic defeat, he adopted a defensive approach designed to wear down the Crusader forces through attrition. This strategy recognized both his own limitations and the inherent weaknesses of European armies operating far from their supply bases. The psychological dimension of the conflict became increasingly important as both leaders recognized that neither possessed the resources for complete victory. Richard's army, while successful in battle, was too small to reconquer all of Saladin's territories. Saladin's forces, though still formidable, could not prevent further Crusader advances without risking another decisive defeat. Diplomatic contacts between the two leaders began during the Siege of Acre and intensified throughout 1191-1192. Both men recognized that a negotiated settlement might serve their interests better than continued warfare. These negotiations, conducted through intermediaries, revealed mutual respect despite their fundamental opposition. The stalemate that developed during 1192 reflected the broader strategic situation. The Crusaders controlled the coast and several major cities, while Saladin retained the interior and, most importantly, Jerusalem. Neither side possessed the strength to eliminate the other, creating conditions that favored a negotiated settlement over continued military action. On September 2, 1192, in the coastal city of Jaffa, Saladin and Richard the Lionheart concluded one of the most significant diplomatic agreements of the medieval period. The Treaty of Jaffa, negotiated after 3 years of devastating warfare, represented not victory for either side, but rather a pragmatic recognition of military and political realities that neither Christian nor Muslim could ignore. The treaty's terms reflected the stalemate that had developed during the Third Crusade. The Crusader states retained control of a narrow coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, ensuring their continued access to European reinforcements and supplies. Saladin kept Jerusalem and the interior territories, maintaining his position as the premier Muslim leader in the region. Most significantly, the agreement established Christian pilgrimage rights to Jerusalem, allowing peaceful religious observance while preserving Muslim political control. For Saladin, the treaty represented both triumph and compromise. He had successfully defended the core of his conquests against the most formidable crusading expedition in history, maintaining control over the symbolic prize of Jerusalem. However, he had been forced to accept the continued existence of Crusader states that he had nearly eliminated after Hattin, acknowledging limits to his military capabilities. Richard's acceptance of the treaty revealed similar mixed results. The English king had restored Crusader military credibility and secured important territorial gains, but he had failed to achieve the primary objective of reclaiming Jerusalem. Domestic political pressures in England, combined with the enormous costs of the expedition, made further campaigning impossible, despite his military successes. The immediate aftermath of the treaty saw both leaders struggling with domestic critics, who viewed the agreement as a betrayal of their respective religious causes. Christian chroniclers condemned Richard for abandoning Jerusalem, while some Muslim observers criticized Saladin for allowing any Crusader presence to survive. These criticisms reflected the gap between ideological expectations and political realities. For Saladin personally, the conclusion of the Third Crusade marked the beginning of a period of reflection and consolidation. At 55, he had spent nearly a quarter century in almost constant warfare, rising from obscure Kurdish origins to become the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. The physical and psychological toll of this sustained effort was becoming increasingly apparent to those around him. The administrative challenges facing the Ayyubid state after 1192 were immense. 3 years of intensive warfare had strained the dynasty's financial resources, while the need to maintain large armies had disrupted normal economic activities throughout Saladin's territories. The costs of defending against the Third Crusade had consumed much of the wealth accumulated during the conquests of the 1180s. More problematically, the extended conflict had revealed weaknesses in the Ayyubid military system. The dynasty's strength depended heavily on Saladin's personal leadership and the loyalty of Kurdish and Turkish military commanders who had been granted territorial fiefs in exchange for service. Some of these commanders had begun developing independent power bases that could challenge central authority. The question of succession, largely ignored during the years of expansion and crisis, became increasingly pressing as Saladin aged and his health declined. The Ayyubid family included numerous potential heirs, Saladin's brothers, sons, and nephews, each with their own territorial base and military following. The absence of clear succession rules created potential for devastating civil war upon Saladin's death. Saladin's efforts to address these challenges revealed both his political sophistication and the inherent limitations of medieval Islamic governance. He attempted to balance competing claims by distributing territories among family members, while maintaining overall coordination through regular councils and shared military campaigns. This system worked reasonably well while Saladin lived, but its long-term viability was questionable. The cultural and religious dimensions of Saladin's later years deserve particular attention. Having achieved his primary military objectives, he increasingly focused on his role as patron of Islamic scholarship and architecture. The construction of madrasas, mosques, and other religious institutions throughout his territories created lasting monuments to Ayyubid rule, while reinforcing the dynasty's commitment to Sunni orthodoxy. Saladin's personal piety, evident throughout his career, became more pronounced during his final years. Contemporary accounts describe increasing attention to religious observances, charitable activities, and consultation with Islamic scholars on matters of law and theology. This religious focus enhanced his legitimacy while providing personal satisfaction after decades of warfare. The economic revival that occurred in Saladin's territories after 1192 demonstrated the benefits of political stability and reduced military expenditure. Trade routes that had been disrupted by constant warfare were restored and protected, while agricultural productivity increased as peasant farmers could work their fields without fear of military devastation. The treaty with the Crusaders actually facilitated some of this recovery by reducing the military burden on the Ayyubid state. Diplomatic relations with other Muslim rulers improved significantly during Saladin's final years. Leaders who had previously viewed him as a threatening rival now recognized the benefits of cooperation with the most successful opponent of the Crusaders. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad granted Saladin additional titles and recognition, while rulers in Yemen, North Africa, and even distant Spain sought diplomatic relationships. However, the fundamental tensions within the Ayyubid system remained unresolved. The dynasty's territories were too extensive to be governed effectively by a single ruler using medieval administrative systems, while the family's Kurdish origins continued to create friction with Arab and Turkish subjects. The military elite's loyalty depended primarily on continued success and generous rewards, both of which would be difficult to maintain during peacetime. Saladin's health began declining noticeably in 1192, though he continued to fulfill his governmental duties with characteristic diligence. The strain of decades of leadership during almost constant crisis had taken its toll, while the adjustment to peacetime governance presented new challenges for someone whose entire career had been shaped by military necessity. The winter of 1192-1193 brought reports of renewed Crusader activity and potential threats to Ayyubid territories. Though these proved to be minor incidents rather than major expeditions, they reminded Saladin that his military successes had not eliminated the fundamental conflict between Islamic and Christian powers in the Levant. The vigilance required to maintain his conquests remained as demanding as the original campaigns to achieve them. Contemporary observers noted changes in Saladin's behavior during his final months. The decisive commander who had unified Muslim resistance to the Crusaders increasingly appeared tired and reflective. His attention to detail in governmental affairs remained impressive, but those closest to him recognized that the great leader was approaching the end of his remarkable career. The question of what would happen to the Ayyubid state after Saladin's death became a subject of intense speculation among both supporters and enemies. The dynasty's achievements were so closely associated with his personal leadership that many doubted whether his successors could maintain the unity and effectiveness he had created. These concerns would prove to be well-founded, as events after 1193 would demonstrate. On March 4, 1193, Saladin died in Damascus at the age of 55, succumbing to what contemporary physicians described as a fever that had afflicted him for several weeks. His death marked not just the end of an extraordinary life, but the beginning of a succession crisis that would ultimately fragment the unified empire he had created and set the stage for the eventual decline of Ayyubid power. The immediate circumstances of Saladin's death reveal much about both his character and the precarious nature of medieval Islamic governance. According to his secretary and biographer, Baha al-Din, Saladin's personal treasury at the time of his death contained only 47 dirhams and 1 dinar, insufficient even to pay for his burial shroud. This poverty was not the result of financial mismanagement, but rather evidence of his extraordinary generosity and commitment to Islamic principles of charitable giving. Throughout his career, Saladin had distributed the vast wealth generated by his conquests among his supporters, religious institutions, and the poor. Contemporary accounts describe a ruler who could not refuse requests for assistance, whether from struggling soldiers, displaced civilians, or religious scholars seeking patronage for their studies. This generosity had been crucial to maintaining loyalty during his rise to power, but it left the dynasty financially vulnerable at the moment of transition. The succession arrangements Saladin had established during his final years reflected both his political sophistication and the impossible challenge of maintaining unity among a large and ambitious family. Rather than designating a single heir, he had distributed territories among his sons and brothers, hoping that shared blood and mutual interests would preserve coordination without creating the fraternal conflicts that had destroyed previous Islamic dynasties. Al-Afdal, Saladin's eldest son, inherited Damascus and the nominal leadership of the dynasty. However, his brothers received equally significant territories. Al-Aziz ruled Egypt, the wealthiest Ayyubid province, while al-Zahir controlled Aleppo and northern Syria. Saladin's brother Al-Adil, the most experienced administrator and military commander after Saladin himself, retained his extensive territories in Palestine and Jordan, making him effectively the most powerful individual in the family. This distribution of power, logical in theory, proved disastrous in practice. Within months of Saladin's death, the Ayyubid princes began competing for additional territories and challenging each other's authority. The unity that had been maintained through Saladin's personal leadership and charisma evaporated, replaced by the kind of fraternal rivalry that had historically plagued Islamic dynasties. The first major crisis came in 1194, when Al-Afdal attempted to assert his authority over his uncle Al-Adil's Palestinian territories. Al-Adil, with decades of military and administrative experience, had no intention of subordinating himself to his inexperienced nephew. The resulting conflict drew in other family members and threatened to dissolve the Ayyubid state entirely just 1 year after Saladin's death. The Crusader states, still recovering from their defeats during the previous decade, watched these developments with keen interest. The fragmentation of Muslim unity provided opportunities that Christian leaders had not enjoyed since before Saladin's rise to power. Some Crusader nobles began forming alliances with individual Ayyubid princes, exploiting family divisions to advance their own territorial ambitions. Al-Adil emerged as the key figure in these succession struggles, demonstrating political skills that rivaled those of his famous brother. Rather than seeking immediate control through military conquest, he positioned himself as a mediator and stabilizer, offering his services to resolve conflicts between his nephews while gradually expanding his own influence. This patient approach would eventually make him the effective ruler of the Ayyubid state. The economic consequences of the succession crisis were immediately apparent. Trade routes that had flourished under unified Ayyubid control were disrupted by internal conflicts, while military expenditures increased as family members maintained separate armies. The financial stability that Saladin had achieved after the Treaty of Jaffa was quickly dissipated in fraternal warfare. More seriously, the succession crisis undermined the ideological foundation of Ayyubid rule. Saladin's legitimacy had rested largely on his role as champion of Islamic unity against Christian aggression. When his heirs began fighting each other instead of defending Muslim territories, this legitimacy was severely damaged. Religious scholars and popular opinion increasingly questioned whether the dynasty deserved continued support. The international implications of Ayyubid fragmentation extended far beyond the immediate region. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, who had granted Saladin extensive recognition and authority, found himself dealing with multiple claimants to Ayyubid legitimacy. The Caliph's response, attempting to play different princes against each other while maintaining nominal support for all of them, further complicated an already chaotic situation. European observers noted the changed circumstances with considerable satisfaction. Pope Celestine III, while not immediately calling for a new crusade, began exploring the possibility of exploiting Ayyubid divisions to recover lost Christian territories. The military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and others began rebuilding their strength in anticipation of renewed offensive operations. The year 1196 marked a crucial turning point in the succession crisis. Al-Aziz, the capable ruler of Egypt, died unexpectedly at the age of 29, leaving his territories to his infant son Al-Mansur under the regency of various competing administrators. This development provided Al-Adil with the opportunity he had been seeking to expand his influence into Egypt, the wealthiest province of the Ayyubid state. Al-Adil's intervention in Egypt demonstrated the military and political skills that had made him indispensable to Saladin. Rather than conquering Egypt through force, he presented himself as the protector of his young nephew's interests against ambitious regents. This approach minimized resistance while achieving his strategic objectives, and by 1200, Al-Adil had become the effective ruler of Egypt while maintaining the fiction of acting on behalf of the legitimate heir. The consolidation of Al-Adil's power marked the beginning of a new phase in Ayyubid history. Unlike Saladin, whose legitimacy rested on personal charisma and military success, Al-Adil based his authority on administrative competence and political pragmatism. This approach proved effective in restoring stability to the dynasty, but it lacked the inspirational quality that had made Saladin a hero throughout the Islamic world. The resolution of the succession crisis by 1202 left the Ayyubid state significantly changed from Saladin's empire. Al-Adil controlled Egypt, Palestine, and Damascus, making him the dominant figure in the dynasty, while other family members retained smaller territories under his overall authority. This arrangement provided stability, but at the cost of the unified leadership that had made the dynasty so formidable under Saladin. The lessons of the succession crisis were not lost on Al-Adil, who began implementing reforms designed to prevent similar problems in the future. However, the fundamental tensions within the Ayyubid system, the balance between family autonomy and central authority, the management of diverse populations and territories, and the maintenance of military effectiveness during peacetime, remained unresolved and would continue to challenge the dynasty throughout its existence. The period from 1193 to 1202 thus represented both the end of the heroic phase of Ayyubid history and the beginning of a more complex era of institutionalized rule. The dynasty survived Saladin's death and the subsequent crisis, but it emerged transformed, with different priorities, different strengths, and different vulnerabilities that would shape its future development and ultimate fate. By 1202, Al-Adil Saif al-Din, known to the Crusaders as Safaddin, had successfully consolidated control over the core territories of the Ayyubid state. His achievement in stabilizing the dynasty after nearly a decade of succession crisis demonstrated political skills that, while different from his brother Saladin's charismatic leadership, were equally crucial for the survival of the Kurdish dynasty in the complex world of medieval Middle Eastern politics. Al-Adil's approach to governance marked a significant evolution in Ayyubid statecraft, where Saladin had relied heavily on personal relationships and the inspiration of jihad. Al-Adil developed more systematic administrative structures designed to function regardless of individual leadership. This institutionalization of power was essential for managing the dynasty's extensive territories, but it also represented a move away from the heroic leadership style that had made Saladin legendary. The administrative reforms implemented during Al-Adil's reign included the standardization of tax collection procedures, the establishment of regular communication systems between different provinces, and the creation of professional bureaucratic positions that were filled based on competence rather than personal loyalty alone. These changes improved governmental efficiency, but also created new centers of power that could potentially challenge family authority. The military organization of the Ayyubid state was similarly reformed during this period. Al-Adil recognized that the dynasty's survival depended on maintaining effective armed forces, but he also understood that the constant warfare of Saladin's era had been financially unsustainable. His solution was to reduce the size of standing armies while improving their training and equipment, creating more cost-effective military forces. The challenge of the Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, provided an unexpected test of these reforms. However, the Crusade's diversion to Constantinople and its ultimate result in the conquest of the Byzantine capital actually benefited the Ayyubid state by eliminating a potential source of military pressure. The destruction of the Byzantine Empire removed a traditional rival, while creating no immediate threat to Muslim territories. Al-Adil's diplomatic response to the Fourth Crusade revealed his sophisticated understanding of international politics. Rather than viewing the crusade as a direct threat, he recognized it as an opportunity to strengthen his position relative to other regional powers. The weakening of Byzantium and the distraction of Western European resources in Constantinople provided the Ayyubid state with a more favorable strategic environment. The economic policies implemented during Al-Adil's reign reflected lessons learned from the succession crisis. Rather than distributing wealth as generously as Saladin had done, Al-Adil maintained substantial financial reserves that could be used to respond to military threats or natural disasters. This more conservative fiscal approach provided stability, but reduced the dynasty's ability to maintain loyalty through generous patronage. Trade policy became a particular focus of Al-Adil's administration. The Ayyubid territories controlled crucial commercial routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the revenues generated by customs duties and trade taxes provided a stable source of income that was less dependent on military conquest. Al-Adil's encouragement of commercial activity, including trade with the Crusader states, generated controversy among religious conservatives, but proved financially beneficial. The relationship between the Ayyubid state and the surviving Crusader territories evolved significantly during this period. Rather than the total warfare that had characterized Saladin's era, Al-Adil pursued a policy of managed coexistence that included both diplomatic agreements and limited military actions. This approach reflected the strategic reality that neither side possessed the resources for decisive victory. Religious policy under Al-Adil continued to emphasize Sunni orthodoxy, but with less of the militant edge that had characterized Saladin's reign. The establishment of madrasas and the patronage of religious scholars continued, but these activities were integrated into broader governmental policies, rather than serving primarily as tools of political legitimacy. This evolution reflected the dynasty's increased confidence and institutional stability. The question of succession planning occupied much of Al-Adil's attention during his later years. Having witnessed the chaos that followed Saladin's death, he was determined to create more effective arrangements for the transfer of power. His solution involved gradually associating his sons with governmental responsibilities while maintaining clear hierarchies of authority that would minimize post-succession conflicts. The broader Islamic world's perception of the Ayyubid state changed during Al-Adil's reign. While Saladin had been viewed as a heroic champion of the faith, Al-Adil was respected more as a capable administrator and realistic politician. This shift reflected both changes in the dynasty's approach to governance and the different challenges facing the Islamic world in the early 13th century. European perceptions of the Ayyubid state also evolved during this period. The legendary status of Saladin in Western chronicles gave way to more pragmatic assessments of Al-Adil as a competent but less charismatic opponent. This change influenced European strategic planning and contributed to the reduced intensity of crusading efforts directed toward the Levant. The internal stability achieved by Al-Adil provided opportunities for cultural and intellectual development that had been limited during the constant warfare of Saladin's era. The patronage of scholars, poets, and architects flourished during this period, creating lasting contributions to Islamic civilization that complemented the dynasty's military and political achievements. However, the foundations of Al-Adil's success contained inherent weaknesses that would eventually challenge the dynasty's survival. The institutionalization of government created bureaucratic interests that might conflict with family priorities, while the policy of coexistence with the Crusader states generated criticism from religious conservatives who favored more aggressive policies. The death of Al-Adil in 1218 would mark the end of the consolidation period and the beginning of new challenges that would test whether the administrative and political structures he had created could survive the pressures of renewed crusading activity and internal dynastic competition. His legacy was the transformation of the Ayyubid state from a charismatic personal enterprise into a functioning governmental system. But the ultimate test of this achievement lay in the future. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217 under the spiritual guidance of Pope Innocent III, represented the most sophisticated and strategically conceived crusading effort since the Third Crusade. Unlike its predecessors, this expedition was based on a comprehensive understanding of Ayyubid's strengths and weaknesses, targeting Egypt as the key to dismantling the entire Muslim defense system in the Levant. The crusading strategists who planned the Fifth Crusade recognized what Saladin himself had understood decades earlier, that Egypt was the financial and logistical foundation of Muslim power in the region. By conquering the Nile Delta and cutting off the flow of Egyptian wealth to Damascus and other Ayyubid territories, the Crusaders could potentially achieve what direct assault on Jerusalem had failed to accomplish. The death of Al-Adil in August 1218, just as the crusading forces were establishing their siege of Damietta, created exactly the kind of succession crisis that the Muslim world could least afford. Al-Adil's careful succession planning proved insufficient to prevent disputes among his sons, with Al-Kamil claiming authority over Egypt, Al-Mu'azzam controlling Damascus and Palestine, and Al-Ashraf ruling the eastern territories from his base in Mesopotamia. The siege of Damietta became a test of whether the Ayyubid state could function effectively without unified leadership. The city's strategic location at the mouth of the Nile made it the key to controlling access to Egypt's interior, and its fall would provide the Crusaders with an ideal base for further conquest. Defense of Damietta thus became symbolic of the dynasty's ability to survive its greatest challenge. Al-Kamil's leadership during the siege revealed both the strengths and limitations of the post-Saladin Ayyubid system. Unlike his uncle Saladin, who had relied heavily on personal charisma and inspirational leadership, Al-Kamil demonstrated exceptional administrative competence and strategic patience. His systematic approach to the defense, including the coordination of multiple armies and the management of complex logistics, showed that the dynasty had developed institutional capabilities that transcended individual leadership styles. The prolonged nature of the siege, lasting from 1218 to 1219, imposed severe strains on both sides. The crusading forces, despite their careful preparation, suffered from disease and supply problems that decimated their ranks. The Ayyubid defenders faced similar challenges, while also dealing with internal political pressures and the need to coordinate with family members who controlled neighboring territories. The fall of Damietta on November 5, 1219, after 17 months of siege, represented one of the most serious defeats suffered by the Ayyubid state. The loss of this crucial city provided the Crusaders with control over the Nile Delta and access to Egypt's agricultural heartland. More importantly, the defeat damaged the dynasty's prestige and encouraged its enemies throughout the region. However, Al-Kamil's response to this crisis demonstrated the resilience that had enabled the Ayyubid dynasty to survive previous challenges. Rather than attempting immediate military recovery of Damietta, he pursued a sophisticated strategy that combined military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and psychological warfare designed to exploit weaknesses in the crusading coalition. The key to Al-Kamil's strategy was his understanding of the crusading expedition's internal divisions. The military leadership, dominated by experienced commanders like John of Brienne, favored consolidating their gains and negotiating a favorable settlement. The papal legate Pelagius, representing the church's interests, insisted on total victory and the complete conquest of Egypt. This fundamental disagreement provided Al-Kamil with opportunities to divide his enemies. Al-Kamil's peace overtures to the Crusaders in 1220 were masterpieces of diplomatic strategy. By offering to return Jerusalem and most of Saladin's other conquests in exchange for the evacuation of Damietta, he presented the Crusaders with exactly what they claimed to want, while simultaneously testing their unity and resolve. The rejection of these offers by Pelagius, despite their acceptance by many military commanders, revealed and exacerbated the expedition's leadership problems. The crusading advance toward Cairo in 1221 provided Al-Kamil with the opportunity he had been seeking. By allowing the enemy forces to penetrate deep into Egypt during the Nile's flood season, he created conditions where their superior numbers and equipment became disadvantages rather than assets. The Crusaders found themselves trapped in terrain they did not understand, facing logistical challenges they had not anticipated. The Battle of Al-Mansura in August 1221 marked the decisive defeat of the Fifth Crusade. Al-Kamil's patient strategy of harassment and attrition, combined with the Nile's annual flooding, forced the crusading army into an untenable position. Faced with complete destruction, the Crusaders were compelled to accept a humiliating settlement that returned Damietta in exchange for safe evacuation from Egypt. The successful defense against the Fifth Crusade established Al-Kamil as a worthy successor to Saladin and Al-Adil, demonstrating that the Ayyubid dynasty possessed the resilience and adaptability necessary to survive major challenges. His combination of military competence, diplomatic skill, and administrative efficiency provided a model for Ayyubid leadership that would influence the dynasty's development for decades. The international implications of the Fifth Crusade's failure were profound. Pope Honorius III, who had inherited the crusading project from Innocent III, was forced to acknowledge that the Ayyubid state could not be destroyed through conventional military means. This realization contributed to changes in crusading strategy that would culminate in the very different approach adopted by Frederick II during his expedition of 1228 to 1229. Within the Islamic world, Al-Kamil's victory restored the Ayyubid dynasty's reputation as the premier defender of Muslim territories against Christian aggression. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad granted him additional titles and recognition, while other Muslim rulers sought alliance with the victorious dynasty. This enhanced prestige provided political benefits that extended far beyond the immediate military success. The economic recovery that followed the Crusaders' evacuation demonstrated the fundamental strength of the Ayyubid economic system. Egyptian agriculture, temporarily disrupted by warfare, quickly returned to productivity, while trade revenues increased as merchants regained confidence in the dynasty's stability. The financial resources generated by this recovery would prove crucial for meeting future challenges. However, the Fifth Crusade also revealed persistent weaknesses in the Ayyubid system. The succession crisis that coincided with the crusading attack had nearly proved catastrophic. suggesting that the dynasty remained vulnerable to leadership transitions. The coordination problems between different family members controlling various territories indicated that institutional development had not fully resolved the challenges of governing the dynasty's extensive domains. The lessons learned from the Fifth Crusade would influence Ayyubid policy for the remainder of the dynasty's existence. The importance of unified leadership, the value of diplomatic as well as military capabilities, and the need for effective intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities all became central themes in subsequent strategic planning. The arrival of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor in the Holy Land in 1228 marked a revolutionary moment in the history of Crusade Muslim relations. Unlike his predecessors, Frederick came not as a conqueror seeking military victory, but as a sophisticated diplomat willing to negotiate a settlement that recognized both Christian and Muslim interests. His encounter with Al-Kamil would produce the most remarkable diplomatic achievement of the medieval period, the peaceful transfer of Jerusalem to Christian control through negotiation rather than conquest. The circumstances surrounding Frederick's crusade were unique in the history of the crusading movement. The emperor had taken the crusading vow years earlier, but had repeatedly delayed his departure, leading to his excommunication by Pope Gregory IX. When Frederick finally arrived in the Levant, he did so as an excommunicate, lacking the moral authority traditionally associated with crusading leadership, but possessing the political sophistication of one of medieval Europe's most capable rulers. Al-Kamil's willingness to negotiate with Frederick reflected both his pragmatic approach to governance and his understanding of the changing political landscape. The Ayyubid ruler recognized that the dynasty faced new challenges in the 1220s, not just from potential crusading expeditions, but from the growing power of the Khwarezmians and other Muslim rivals who threatened Ayyubid territories from the east. The negotiations between Frederick and Al-Kamil, conducted largely through written correspondence and diplomatic intermediaries, revealed a mutual respect and understanding that transcended religious differences. Both rulers were educated men who shared interests in philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. Their exchanges included discussions of intellectual topics alongside political negotiations, creating a foundation for agreement that went beyond mere strategic calculation. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed on February 18, 1229, established a 10-year truce and arranged for the transfer of Jerusalem to Christian control under specific conditions. Al-Kamil retained control of the Temple Mount and its Islamic holy sites, while Frederick gained access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other Christian shrines. This compromise recognized the legitimate interests of both faiths while avoiding the total victory that neither side could achieve militarily. The reaction to this diplomatic settlement revealed the limitations of both Christian and Muslim religious extremism. Pope Gregory IX condemned the treaty as insufficient because it failed to provide complete Christian control over Jerusalem, while many Crusader nobles criticized Frederick for negotiating with infidels rather than conquering them. Similarly, some Muslim religious leaders accused Al-Kamil of betraying Islamic interests by voluntarily surrendering Islam's third holiest city. However, the practical benefits of the settlement were immediately apparent. Trade between Christian and Muslim territories flourished under the stable conditions created by the treaty, generating revenues that benefited both sides. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem resumed under peaceful conditions, while the reduction in military expenditures allowed both rulers to address other priorities in their respective territories. The success of Frederick's diplomatic crusade established a new model for Christian-Muslim relations that emphasized negotiation and compromise over total warfare. This approach recognized the reality that neither side possessed the resources for complete victory, making accommodation a more practical alternative than continued conflict. The precedent set by the 1229 Treaty would influence subsequent attempts to resolve the fundamental conflicts between Christian and Muslim interests in the Holy Land. Al-Kamil's domestic policies during the 1230s reflected the stability and resources generated by his diplomatic success. The decade of peace provided opportunities for internal development that had been limited during periods of constant military pressure. Infrastructure projects, including the construction and repair of irrigation systems, roads and fortifications, improved the economic productivity and defensive capabilities of Ayyubid territories. The patronage of scholarship and culture that flourished during this period created lasting contributions to Islamic civilization. The court at Cairo became a center of learning that attracted scholars from throughout the Islamic world, while the translation and preservation of classical texts ensured the survival of important intellectual traditions. These cultural achievements complemented the dynasty's political and military successes, creating a comprehensive legacy that extended far beyond territorial conquest. However, the peaceful interlude of the 1230s also revealed emerging challenges that would ultimately threaten the Ayyubid dynasty's survival. The Mongol expansion under Genghis Khan and his successors created pressures in Central Asia and Mesopotamia that would eventually reach the Middle East. More immediately, the rise of the Ayyubid Mamluks, the slave soldiers who formed the core of the dynasty's military forces, created a potential source of internal challenge to family rule. The Mamluk system had been adopted by the Ayyubids as a solution to the recruitment challenges facing any medieval Islamic dynasty. By purchasing young slaves, converting them to Islam, and training them as professional soldiers, the dynasty could create military forces whose loyalty was theoretically guaranteed by their dependence on their masters. This system had proved effective in providing high-quality troops, but it also created a military elite whose interests might diverge from those of their royal masters. The growth of Mamluk influence during the peaceful years of the 1230s and 1240s was gradual but persistent. As the dynasty relied increasingly on these professional soldiers for its security, the Mamluks gained political as well as military importance. Their commanders were consulted on policy decisions, granted administrative positions, and given territorial fiefs that made them stakeholders in the dynasty's success. However, this integration also made them potential competitors for ultimate authority. The question of Ayyubid succession remained problematic, despite the reforms implemented by previous rulers. Al-Kamil's death in 1238 triggered another round of family disputes, though these were resolved more quickly and with less disruption than earlier succession crises. The appointment of his son as-Salih Ayyub as his successor represented continuity, but also highlighted the ongoing challenges of managing a dynasty whose territories required different types of leadership and administrative approaches. As-Salih Ayyub's reign, 1240-1249, would represent both the final flowering of Ayyubid power and the beginning of the dynasty's decline. His military successes, including the recovery of Jerusalem from the Crusaders when the Treaty of Jaffa expired, demonstrated that the dynasty retained its capacity for effective action. However, his increasing reliance on Mamluk forces and his conflicts with other family members created vulnerabilities that his enemies would eventually exploit. The broader historical context of the 1240s included developments that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the Middle East. The Mongol conquests were approaching the borders of the Islamic world, while internal conflicts within the Ayyubid family were weakening the dynasty's unity. Most significantly, the Mamluks were developing the organizational coherence and political ambitions that would eventually make them the dominant force in Egypt and Syria. The irony of the Ayyubid dynasty's situation by the mid-13th century was that its greatest strength, the creation of professional military forces capable of defending its territories against external threats, had also created the instrument of its eventual downfall. The Mamluks, who had been recruited to serve the Kurdish dynasty, would ultimately replace it, establishing a new form of Islamic governance that would dominate the region for centuries. The death of As-Salih Ayyub on November 23, 1249, during the Seventh Crusade's assault on Egypt, marked the beginning of the end for the Ayyubid dynasty. His widow, Shajar al-Dur, and the Mamluk commanders who had served as his military elite faced the immediate challenge of defending Egypt against Louis IX of France, while managing a succession crisis that would ultimately destroy the Kurdish dynasty that had dominated the medieval Middle East for nearly a century. The circumstances of As-Salih Ayyub's death could not have been worse for the dynasty's survival. The Seventh Crusade, led by the capable and determined Louis IX, had achieved initial successes that surpassed those of previous expeditions. The crusading forces had captured Damietta and were advancing toward Cairo when the Sultan died, leaving his inexperienced son, Turanshah, as his designated heir, while the kingdom faced its gravest external threat since the Fifth Crusade. Shajar al-Dur's decision to conceal her husband's death until Turanshah could arrive from Mesopotamia demonstrated both political sophistication and the precarious nature of Ayyubid authority. The successful defense of Egypt during this transition, culminating in Louis IX's capture at the Battle of Al-Mansura in April 1250, represented the dynasty's final military triumph, but it also revealed how dependent the Ayyubids had become on their Mamluk soldiers. The Mamluks who achieved this victory were led by commanders like Baybars al-Bundugdari and Qutuz, who had risen through the military hierarchy during As-Salih Ayyub's reign. These men possessed not only exceptional military skills, but also the political ambition and organizational capabilities necessary to challenge the dynasty they had served. Their success against the Seventh Crusade provided them with the prestige and confidence needed to make their ultimate bid for power. Turanshah's arrival in Egypt in February 1250 should have stabilized the succession and preserved Ayyubid rule. However, the new sultan's attempts to replace his father's Mamluk commanders with his own supporters created fatal tensions within the military elite. The Mamluks, who had just saved Egypt from Christian conquest, were unwilling to accept marginalization by an inexperienced ruler who lacked both military credibility and political skill. The assassination of Turanshah on May 2, 1250, by a group of Mamluk officers marked the formal end of Ayyubid rule in Egypt. This violent act was not merely a palace coup, but rather the culmination of decades of gradual power transfer from the Kurdish royal family to their Turkish and Circassian slave soldiers. The Mamluks had evolved from servants into masters, replacing the dynasty that had created them. The establishment of the Mamluk Sultanate under the leadership of Izz al-Din Aybak represented a revolutionary change in Islamic governance. For the first time in Islamic history, former slaves had successfully seized control of a major state and established their own dynasty. This transformation reflected both the effectiveness of the Mamluk system in creating military elites and the inherent instability of relying on slave soldiers for dynastic security. The survival of Ayyubid branches in Syria and other territories provided temporary continuity for the dynasty, but these remaining princes lacked the resources and unity necessary to challenge Mamluk control of Egypt. The gradual absorption of these territories by the expanding Mamluk Sultanate over the following decades completed the destruction of the Kurdish dynasty that had once seemed destined to dominate the Islamic world. The historical significance of the Ayyubid collapse extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. The dynasty's fall marked the end of the last great Kurdish attempt to establish a major Islamic state, while the rise of the Mamluks initiated a new phase of Middle Eastern history, characterized by military slavery and institutional governance rather than tribal or family-based rule. The Ayyubid legacy in military affairs proved remarkably durable despite the dynasty's political extinction. The Mamluks, who destroyed Ayyubid rule, continued to employ the military techniques, administrative systems, and strategic approaches developed during the Kurdish period. Saladin's innovations in siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and intelligence gathering remained standard practice throughout the Mamluk era. More broadly, the Ayyubid experience with managing diverse populations, complex territories, and multiple external threats provided lessons that influenced subsequent Islamic governance. The dynasty's emphasis on religious legitimacy, administrative efficiency, and military professionalism became defining characteristics of successful medieval Islamic states, regardless of their ethnic or dynastic origins. The cultural and intellectual contributions of the Ayyubid period created lasting impacts that transcended political boundaries. The madrasas established during Saladin's and his successors' reigns continued to function under Mamluk rule, preserving and transmitting Islamic learning across generational and dynastic transitions. The architectural monuments constructed during the Ayyubid era, including the citadel of Damascus and numerous mosques and fortifications, remained symbols of Islamic power and cultural achievement. The Ayyubid approach to Christian-Muslim relations, exemplified by Saladin's conduct during the conquest of Jerusalem and Al-Kamil's negotiations with Frederick II, established precedents for diplomatic engagement that influenced subsequent interactions between Islamic and Christian powers. The dynasty's demonstration that religious conflict could be managed through negotiation and accommodation provided alternatives to the total warfare that characterized much of medieval international relations. The economic policies developed during the Ayyubid period, particularly the emphasis on trade facilitation and agricultural development, created prosperity that survived the dynasty's political collapse. The commercial networks established during Kurdish rule continued to generate wealth under Mamluk administration, providing the economic foundation for the continued importance of Egypt and Syria in medieval international commerce. Perhaps most significantly, the Ayyubid experience demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of medieval Islamic governance. The dynasty's rise from obscure Kurdish origins to control over vast territories showed that talent and determination could overcome social and ethnic barriers in the Islamic world. However, their ultimate defeat by their own slave soldiers revealed the inherent instability of political systems based on military force without adequate institutional safeguards. The modern Middle East continues to grapple with issues that first emerged during the Ayyubid period: the tension between central authority and local autonomy, the challenge of governing diverse populations with different religious and ethnic identities, and the difficulty of maintaining political stability in a region subject to constant external pressures. The Ayyubid example provides both inspiration and cautionary lessons for contemporary leaders facing similar challenges. The enduring fascination with Saladin and the Ayyubid dynasty in both Islamic and Western cultures reflects the universal appeal of their story. The rise of underdogs to greatness, the struggle between different civilizations and faiths, and the ultimate fragility of all human achievements. Their legacy serves as a reminder that historical greatness lies not just in military conquest or political power, but in the ability to transcend the limitations of one's time and create lasting contributions to human civilization. The story of the Ayyubid dynasty spans exactly 100 years, from Saladin's appointment as vizier of Egypt in 1169 to the assassination of the last Ayyubid Sultan in Egypt in 1250. In that century, a Kurdish family rose from military service to create an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, challenged the greatest powers of medieval Europe, and left an indelible mark on the history of both the Islamic world and Western civilization. The rise and fall of the Ayyubids illustrates fundamental themes that transcend their specific historical moment. The tension between idealistic religious motivation and pragmatic political necessity, the challenge of maintaining unity among diverse populations and territories, and the ultimate fragility of political systems based on personal charisma and military force. All of these issues remain relevant to understanding power and governance in any era. Saladin's legacy extends far beyond his military victories and political achievements. His demonstration that leadership could combine religious conviction with tolerance for other faiths, that political success could coexist with personal integrity, and that power could be exercised with both strength and mercy, provided a model of governance that continues to inspire leaders throughout the world. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next documentary.